Hi everyone. Okay, just like we did notes last time on a video, you're going to get into Notability, you're going to go to your English folder, and you're going to open up a new note. I want you to name this one Shakespeare Notes. And before we start, I just want to remind you of some of the tools that I'm using in Notability to help you line things up and format in the same way that I am. So keep in mind that we are trying to do this as a modified version of Cornell Notes, which means that all the terms and the keywords that you need to know are going to be along the left, and then the definitions for those terms are going to be pushed over to the right. So it's this button right here that moves your text over to the right, and then a little later you might need some bullet points. So remember, the bullet button is over here, and the one that you're going to use is right in the middle. And that will come a little bit later. Okay? As I said, we're going to write these notes kind of in a modified Cornell Notes manner. So just like before, I'm going to have you draw a black line between the terms on the left and the definitions on the right. Now, some of these terms are kind of long. If you look down the page, I have iambic pentameter down there. That's pretty long. So just make sure that your line is drawn fairly far out so you have enough room to get all of the terms in there without running into the other side of your notes. As we go along, I'm going to highlight things. You don't have to highlight. That's just so that you can kind of keep track of where I am in the notes. You don't have to highlight at all. If you end up highlighting everything, then it's going to make nothing seem important. So just know that I'm doing that to help you. Okay, so we're going to start the notes. So the first thing that I want you to write up at the top is Shakespearean verse. That's one of the categories that we're going to talk about. We'll talk about two categories during these notes. Okay, so you're going to write Shakespearean verse up there at the top, and then your first term is verse. And verse is just another word for poetry. It's that simple. It's writing that has some kind of meter or rhythm, which we'll talk about later. And it can rhyme, but it doesn't have to. Shakespeare used verse a lot in his plays, and sometimes he would use the verse to show that a character was more noble or more important because they had a more elevated way of speaking in this poetry. So he would use that to show their social class sometimes. The next term is prose. And prose is very simply the opposite of poetry. That's just regular writing. If you read an article, the newspaper, a book, all of that is prose. They're not trying to put any kind of meter or rhythm in there. They won't use a lot of rhyme. And Shakespeare would also use prose to show a social class of a person, but prose was usually for people who were kind of lower class. Their speaking wasn't as elevated, it wasn't as fancy, so he just used prose, regular writing, to try to show you that this was a regular kind of person. Okay, this next term is called iambic pentameter, and that is just a kind of verse that has to do with the rhythm of the words. This was the verse form that was most used by Shakespeare. It shows up a lot in his plays. And again, because it's poetry and it's a specific rhythm, you're going to hear this spoken by people who were usually more upper class. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot more later, but what you need to know about it is that iambic pentameter has 5 heavy beats per line. Okay, that won't make a lot of sense to you right now. You're going to have to trust me. It comes from 2 Latin terms. It comes from penta, meaning 5, and meter, which technically means measure, but in this case we're going to talk about it as beats. If I were to write this rhythm out, it would look like this. Okay, again, I know this doesn't make much sense to you right now, but I promise it will later. Okay, these straight lines going up and down, those are considered the heavy beats. Those are the syllables that really get a little oomph. And the ones that look a little bit like shallow U's, those are the syllables that do not get a lot of oomph. Okay, and if you notice, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these heavy beats that would happen on a line. Okay, this one of these guys right here, this is called an iamb. And that's how iambic pentameter gets its name. So it's basically that form, that rhythm, repeated 5 times. That's the pentameter. And as I said, I promise we'll talk about this more later, but for now, just write that down and then it'll make more sense. Okay, the next one is a rhyming couplet. And that is basically, this is another verse form. It is a mini poem. So it's 2 lines that have rhyming words at the end. They usually form a thought, and an easy way to remember it is a couple of lines that rhyme. Okay, we're going to bring up rhyming couplets again in just a minute when we talk about the next form, and that is a sonnet. We started talking about this in class a little bit, but a sonnet is just another kind of poem. It's a verse form. But this one has specific rules that it has to follow if it wants to be a sonnet. So one of the rules is it has to have 14 lines. It's going to be written in iambic pentameter, which we just talked about up above. The rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern for a sonnet is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So remember that in a poem, if the lines have letters at the end, if you put a letter for the word that rhymes, the letters match, that means those lines have words that rhyme. So the A and the A, those are rhyming lines. And the B and the B, those are rhyming lines. And that one at the end, the GG, that's a rhyming couplet. You can tell because there's 2 in a row, and they rhyme because they both have a G and a G. Okay, more on that later, but just trust me that this will all make more sense. The last one is a soliloquy. Now this is not always verse. It often is, but it doesn't have to be. But a soliloquy is just a long speech where a character is on stage by themselves. They're talking to themselves and they're revealing inner thoughts and emotions. So if you look at the way soliloquy is spelled, you might notice soli, right? And that comes from the word for solo, the root for solo, which means alone. So that helps you remember that this character is alone on stage when they're talking to themselves. Okay, now we're starting another category. We finished up with Shakespearean verse, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the themes. Okay, we started talking about this in class, and this is just to get it down on paper and to remember some things. I'm going to start again. Oh, don't forget to draw your little line here to separate the terms from the definitions. And I'm going to remind you of what a theme is. Okay, a theme is just the central message or a big driving idea in a story that the reader just keeps bumping up against or running into in some way. Longer stories can have more than one, and Romeo and Juliet certainly does. We're going to talk about 3 in your notes. Okay, so the first one, of course, is love. Romeo and Juliet is a love story, so that would make perfect sense. I'm going to have you write 4 different kinds of love, and I just want you to leave a little space because we're going to put some examples in there once we actually start discussing this. So the first one, the first kind of love, is sexual love or sensual love. So this is love that focuses more on lust or sex or the senses. It might, when I talk about senses, I mean the love might focus on how the person looks or how they smell or how their skin feels, anything that has to do with the senses. Okay, and like I mentioned before, just make sure that you leave a little space down here so that we can put some examples in later when we finish the play. Okay, the second kind of love is affected love, or sometimes they call it puppy love. This is infatuation. Okay, you're not really in love, you think you are. Sometimes people are pretending at being in love. They are acting the way that they've seen other people act, that they knew were in love, or the way they think they're supposed to act when they're in love. Usually this kind of love involves a lot of drama, big emotions, right? If they have a fight, it's a gigantic fight, and there's a lot of crying. And if this kind of love is unreturned, or if it's one-sided, if only one person is interested, you like somebody but they don't like you back, then that kind of love is called unrequited love. And that just means that it's unreturned. The other person doesn't love you the way that you love them. Okay, the third kind is conventional or traditional love. This is the kind of love that follows the rules of society, right? This is the kind of love that parents would approve of. If the parents arranged a marriage, sometimes this happened in Elizabethan society, especially if they were rich, or if they were nobility, or a king or a queen, princes and princesses. Sometimes you didn't really have a choice who you married. Your parents would arrange the marriage, sometimes even when they were infants. If you were 6 months old and you were, your dad was the king of Britain, and the king of France said, hey, my son is 8 months old and I want him to marry your daughter when they're old enough. They might make that arrangement when you were just babies, and then you would have no choice about who you were going to marry. And that was done to make sure maybe that France and Britain didn't go to war, or to make sure that two countries always were getting along. Another kind of conventional or traditional love might be that if a man wants to marry a woman, he has to get the father's permission before he can marry the daughter. So these are the kinds of things that society says, here's the way it's going to be, and then that is the way that the love turns out. The fourth kind is true love. This is kind of the deep, long-lasting sort of love that most people think of when they think of being in love. This kind of love is more mature than puppy love. There won't be a lot of big emotions and big fights and crying going on. Okay, this is people who are a little bit more mature about being in love. Okay, so the next theme is death. We talked about this a little bit in class too. I'm just going to put some points down. You can copy these down, and then once again, just leave a little space. In between these, we're going to put some examples in here after you've read the book and we have a chance to talk about it a little bit. So one thing to think about, one way to prove that death is a theme, is that the body count in this play is high. By the time we get to the end, you should be able to give me a number about how many people die in this play. Number two, there are several references to suicide. Lots of people saying or threatening that they're going to kill themselves. So pay attention as you're reading to how many times somebody refers to suicide or threatens suicide, worries about suicide. Okay, number three, there are several references to Juliet as Death's bride. Juliet is going to marry Death. Juliet is going to sleep with Death. Death might be somebody's heir, meaning that they're the person who's going to get all of their money. So pay attention to those times when Juliet is being referred to as being married to Death. And then just put the number 4 down there. We're not going to fill that out until after you finish reading the play, but there is one more thing that I want to talk about as far as proving that death might be a theme, one way that you bump up against it in the play. And then the last one is fate. We also talked about this a little bit in class. Before we can really talk about it, we should have a definition. So destiny is another word for fate. It is an impersonal force that determines the outcome of a person's life. So this is just a force outside yourself that decides what your life is going to be like, who you might marry, who you'll meet later, what your job is going to be like, when you're going to die. And it doesn't really care. It's not that it likes you or doesn't like you. It's impersonal. It has no special feelings about you. But it just decides that this is when this is going to happen, and you don't have a lot of choice about it. And then under there, I just want you to write how fate affects the action. Once again, we're going to fill that in after you finish reading the play, and we're just going to kind of go through the timeline and see how many times fate steps in and kind of twists things so that it's going to happen exactly the way fate wanted it, no matter what else happens. And just like before, if you listened to the whole thing and you were faithful about paying attention to the audio part as well as the video part, why don't you send me an email that says, "Give me 5, Miss Manning," and I will.